Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening to wherever you are joining me from around the world. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be leading you through today's webinar. Let me introduce myself. I'm James Booth, and I'm very proud to represent Silent 8 as their global head of anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism, and sanctions. And I'm thrilled to be leading you through an area that is a particular passion around mine. And here we're going to be talking about what the issues are surrounding global transparency, particularly with some recent regulatory reform in the United States and how that's going to impact the fight against financial crime. But I want to take a step away from a moment from the nuances of the regulatory landscape and actually focus on what the humanitarian issue of this looks like. And of course, sprinkle in some horizon scanning and consider how technology is going to help support those efforts to fight this. Now, a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So this session is live. What I'd like to do first and foremost is just see who we have joining us. So at the moment, I can see the numbers are still rising. You do have ways which you can interact and engage with me. So throughout the duration of this event, I will encourage questions. I do have a particular moment in today's session that I will focus a little bit more on the angle of Q&A, but please do get those questions in through the Q&A function, and your fellow peers can upvote them or downvote them, and I will cherry pick some of the sort of most liked ones if I'm able to ask those. But of course, you are able to engage with each other. And what I'd quite like to do, just so we can get a feel of the technology, and I'm sure many of you have used Zoom, is just using the chat box. Just briefly introduce yourself. So in there, if you could put your name, your job title, and the jurisdiction you are joining us from, and let's see who is joining us from the furthest distance around the world from where I'm sitting here in the United Kingdom at the moment. Now, as you are populating that, and I will do some personal shout outs in just a moment, I'm going to share my screen. Today's not going to be death by PowerPoint because I really want to bring some of the emotion and true issues into this. And to be able to do that, I'm going to lean on your input as well. So as we move through an interactive case study, we'll be able to talk about, what your experiences were around that and some of the challenges around that as well. So I can see one or two people have already dropped into the chat. So please keep those coming as I momentarily share my screen. I'm working off a series of different monitors, but you should in a moment be able to see that image on the screen. So again, keep that chat coming. You can see it pinging up on my screen. But here we are. Uneven ground, the US and UBO exemption and the ripple effects on global anti-money laundering efforts. So let me momentarily share today's agenda. It looks quite long, considering that we've only got about 45 minutes, but we will work through this in rapid time. And the idea is, I'm not here to tell you what the regulation needs to change to. I'm not here to tell you how to do your jobs. I'm here to help disrupt your thought processes so that this issue that we see on a day-to-day basis, we recognize, we do something about it. We shift the culture around this fight against global financial crime, and particularly how these corporate entities and the shadows and the secrecy that they operate in are contributing to this global problem. So when you leave today's event, it's a good thing that you want to know what to do with the next piece of legislation. I want you to look at the problem, think about the challenge differently, and take away what you would do the next time you encounter this problem. And I guarantee that you will. So in a moment, I'm going to shine the spotlight very firmly. In fact, it's been shining since 2016 when there was a particular landmark event that happened within the media that really shone the spotlight on this global problem of opaque or very difficult to interpret ownership and structure. So we'll start by talking about that. And then we'll underpin this with what was quite a pivotal moment in the regulatory landscape, of course, and that was the implementation of the US Corporate Transparency Act. Now, there are various iterations of this that have taken place around the world. We've, of course, seen this discharged through the EU money laundering directives, but there has been change. There's been developments, and those developments genuinely threaten and harm the efforts to stop illicit actors abusing the trust corporate service provider world to move their ill-gotten gains. Now, that's the regulatory perspective, but this has a human cost. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to take you through a real life immersive situation that displays the problem at the very forefront. Simply not just by considering where the weaknesses in our controls are, but actually how what appears to be one small problem in various pockets of the world contribute to the global problem that is money laundering. We will also be thinking about what the real cost of that is. Now, there is a lot of academic studies, and I've read many of these academic studies. And for those of you who have seen me speak on this particular issue before, you will have heard me speak about some of these problems in the past. We have to change the thought process and the mindset. This is no longer a dollar issue. We need to remove that monetary problem that's attached to this. But what does that mean? How are we seeing that transpose? And how do we shift that mindset away to not just attach a dollar value to this, but the real human cost? Now, technology is evolving all the time. I am a huge advocate of the power of AI. Now, the biggest misconception, of course, is that AI is going to do away with the humanitarian involvement of trying to stop some of these issues. That could not be further from the truth. And what I'm going to talk about is actually how these can work almost hand in glove to support these efforts, but also leave us with some thought processes on what global international cooperation should look like when it comes to this effort. And we'll consider how that transparency gap and AI are able to bridge that. Now, my chat has been pinging off in the background, so let's see who we have with us. And I know there's many of you that are in the background. So Salim from the United Kingdom in the Northwest, not too far from me. Michael, you're joining us from Delaware, of course, a region in the United States which is particularly impacted by some of the recent changes to the Corporate Transparency Act. Carrie, great to have you, New Jersey. We've got Christina from the New York office, Carrie in the USA, Claudia in the New York as well. And I'm going to be joining you in New York in a couple of months' time. Keep an eye on my LinkedIn for some big announcements around what I'm doing there. A few more because I'm going to run out of time. Lewis in Miami, Taya in New York, Ray in New York, Alex, North Carolina, Andrew in Charlotte as well, LaShawn, New York, and Ariana from New York City as well. Thank you to those that have dropped a chat in now. Please feel free to engage and network on that chat. But I would like to make a start by talking about this global spotlight that is beneficial ownership. So let me ask you a question. Have you ever wondered how the ultra wealthy hide their money? Well, in 2016, the world got a rare look behind the curtain. And that was very much thanks to the Panama Papers. Now, the Panama Papers rocked the world in one of the largest leaks in journalistic history. And in fact, it was a data dump that was so vast and it was so revealing, it shook governments. It in fact toppled leaders and exposed a secret of financial dealings of some of the richest and most powerful people in the world. And there was lots of very well-known individuals, leaders of governments, oligarchs, sports stars, royal family members. Now, when the Panama Papers were leaked, and in fact there were about 11.5 million documents that exposed some of the politicians and in fact criminals and business moguls that used offshore companies to hide their assets, but allegedly to hide some of their ill-gotten gains again. Now, I use the word alleged very, very carefully. Now, for those of us that work inside the stratosphere of anti-money laundering and financial crime or due diligence, we're all very aware of the concept of open source media or negative news. Actually, I'm not a big fan of the term negative news because that creates a connotation that we're trying to find something negative. Now, in my investigative career, the Panama Papers was arguably one of the biggest issues that I saw surfaced and one of the biggest reactive measures that many organizations and particularly financial institutions initiated to try and understand, are my customers in there? What are my customers doing within that database? Now, the database itself is publicly accessible And I would advise that for those of you who operate in the name screening territory or open source media, it can act as a really good data point, really just to open the question. One thing I'll just tell everybody is just because your client or a known individual appears in the Panama Papers or an equivalent, the Pandora Papers, the Bahama Papers, and so on, it does not mean that criminality has taken place. Because as we know, offshore vehicles and trust corporate service providers can be used very legitimately. In fact, many of you in attendance here probably used trusts without even knowing about it. If you have a life insurance policy, it's wrapped in a trust because it generally provides some tax optimization. Now, where the issue stems, of course, is the individuals who understand through professional money laundering services, and we recognize those to be within the real estate sector or the trust and corporate service world, as we're talking about now, specifically with some of the regulation that we're going to be talking about. There are professionals that understand the limitations of the due diligence that's required. Now, due diligence is a legal requirement in many parts of the world. The regulators say we have to have it because they have been influenced by intergovernmental bodies like the FATF, who we know are the global standard at setting recommendations and standards on how we should combat money laundering and counter the financing of terrorism. So these professional enablers know the right questions to ask, but crucially, the right questions not to ask, so that they don't uncover specific issues that some of these individuals who are looking to abuse this sector have to disclose. Now, how did all of this come about? Well, an anonymous whistleblower known as John Doe, quite a generic name, isn't it, leaked the files to a German newspaper. Now, they partnered with a very reputable and well-known investigative journalist known as the ICIJ, bringing reporters together from hundreds of 100 media outlets around the world. And what they found was, of course, this tranche of heads of state, celebrities, royal family members that had this, and even Netflix serialized this. I'm not sure I should promote Netflix, but there is a really good film that was made called The Laundromat that talks about how this was uncovered through that Panamanian law firm Mossack Fonseca. Now, the fallout was huge. In fact, Iceland's prime minister resigned. Dozens of world leaders faced scrutiny. Criminal investigations were launched. Governments around the globe lobbied for more financial transparency. So the Panama Papers didn't just uncover corruption, it fundamentally changed the conversation about global inequality, tax justice, and the power of investigative journalism. Now, for those of you that work in the private sector, of course, you will remember the day that these data leaks dropped. Remediation teams were formed. More due diligence was initiated. Enhanced due diligence was initiated. Open source screening, name screening, transaction monitoring alerts. More SARs were being filed. We exited customers. There was reputational impact from organizations that were involved in this. So what did this provoke globally? Well, this, of course, provoked the first real discussion to get regulatory change and to start to bring in standards on how transparency of ownership should happen globally. Now, this transposed and manifested itself in lots of different ways. The EU, through their money laundering directives, within the fourth money laundering directive, started to draft almost legislation, and that legislation very much started to focus upon creation of databases within EU members, which EU members needed to create a central repository of beneficial owners and controllers. Now, that's very important because ownership and control, with respect to the FATF, are deemed to be the same thing, and that's because of the legal type that can be used. Now, through that fourth directive, of course, it required those beneficial registers to be created so that law enforcement and financial intelligence units could lean on that data to help with their investigations. Now, that's maybe one of the first challenges. Why was that data only made accessible at the time to financial intelligence units and law enforcement? Because surely financial institutions act as these huge pools of data sources for governments and intelligence units. That's the real value in SARS. And in fact, SARS We're talking in the United States 2 to 2.5 million a year. In the United Kingdom, the second biggest SAR filer, we're talking around 1 million. So intelligence units need all that data to help understand owners and controllers and natural persons and where these funds are moving around the world. So that piece of legislation evolved to the fifth EU money laundering directive that then said, well, these registers now should be made public. They should be accessible for individuals, private firms to access them, to interpret some of that information to support with investigations. Again, making that data more transparent. Because the idea being, of course, if that information is more transparent, well, a financial institution would be able to access that information. They would then be able to use it as part of their investigations, as part of the due diligence. That should, in theory, deter the criminals. That's the principle. Now, of course, we know that the United States made a significant change to their corporate transparency as well, with a game-changing act known as the US Corporate Transparency Act. Now, that in 2024, groundbreaking as it was seen in the media, was aimed at curbing that illicit financial activity. And the idea, of course, that it would end the era of anonymous shell companies operating within the United States. Now, of course, in many states, there was very favorable tax treatment, protection of individuals' identity, whether or not that was for illicit means, or, of course, legal means. Now, under the CTA, of course, most corporations like LLCs and various entities that were formed or registered in the US had a legal obligation to file detailed information about their beneficial owners, or as the terminology that is used globally, natural persons. And they were for individuals who owned or controlled at least 25% or exercised substantial control. Now, I'm very confident that many of you are already aware of this. Now, there were lots of resources available. GFI, Global Financial Integrity, helped sort of develop methodologies and reports to understand that the US actually was alleged to facilitate more anonymous shell companies than any other country prior to the CTA. Now, here, that's incredibly impressive statistic considering that many jurisdictions, particularly those in the Caribbean, set up their attraction to investors because of that anonymity that they offer. It was also alleged that by the World Bank in a study that took place in 2020, that over 70% of global corruption cases involved anonymous companies in the United States. So the problem was real. We saw it, we recognized it, and legislation was transposed to support that. But of course, we land ourselves in 2025. And in March of 2025, the US Department of Treasury, or FinCEN as they're of course known, suspended enforcement of the CTA and the reporting requirements for domestic companies and US citizens. Now, while we are not going to go into the weeds and start to dissect those specific parts of legislation, the headline is, of course, that the rollback significantly weakened the US's capacity to deter any financial crime. Now, this just wasn't a United States issue. This was an issue that happened across the world. And within the EU, you may remember that I also said, well, the fifth money laundering directive brought in that public database. Well, actually, around 70% of EU members didn't truly cooperate in the spirit of the law. And in fact, what they did was many jurisdictions placed that data behind a paywall. In fact, three jurisdictions didn't even bother to create a register at all. And then it was challenged in a high court and the requirement was removed. So this is simply not just a US issue. This has now spread globally. So the challenge this creates is, are we taking a step backwards in the global efforts of fighting financial crime? Now, I'd like to bring some of you into this conversation, and my thanks to those of you by this. Now, I just want to be clear. I'm not getting into any conversations today about specific administrations, current or prior, challenging their legislative approach. I'm trying to bring in what the global problem of this issue is, and we're going to rear that up. Now, at this point, I would really welcome your input. So thanks to those, we see that the chat functionality is working well. I have a question for you all. And I'd be really grateful if you could complete that data for me, that chat box for me. How much money, and let's keep this in US dollars, how much money do you think is being laundered globally each year? So let's get pause for a moment. So in the chat box, if you could just populate how much money do you think is being laundered globally? So Karthik, thank you, my friend. You started the bar very high at $7 trillion. Now, it's very tempting here to jump into a game show host mode and start saying the higher or lower than Karthik. But Hamid has gone a little bit more specific in some of the data. So we've got 5% of the world GDP. Michael, 350 billion. Louis, you've written to me in the Q&A, 500 billion. Uh, Brian, no less than 5 trillion. Anna, 2 trillion. Okay. Now, there is an issue very clearly playing out inside this, in that we've got some fantastic minds in attendance, some inspiring individuals in this event, but we can't even agree on a consensus of how much money is being laundered. I think that's contributing to the problem. Because what we tend to think about when we talk about global money laundering, we think money, don't we? We think of cash. And we're all very familiar with this traditional process of placement, of layering, integration. Now, in my opinion, that model of placement, layering, and integration is quite an outdated model. And I think many of you know where I'm taking this conversation. And that's because, of course, we see global money laundering shifting away from cold, hard cash to asset. We can transfer assets around the world that have been sourced through criminal activity and launder that. So while the place of placement, layer, and integration may still have a place for those of you that offer training to your first line members of staff in a financial institution, what we have is an intrinsic dirty value that moves through a process that has a clean value attached to this at the end. And Karthik, you summarized that very well, my friend. So gold and precious metals. Well, let's bring this back to the trust and corporate service world, because we're of course we're talking about the US Corporate Transparency Act. It's very easy to simply shift the ownership of this around. So this is the first problem. Not all money laundering is cash. It's quite an unusual thing to say, isn't it? To say that, well, it's called money laundering, so why say it's not cash? So what we've seen here is an issue play out that actually, think like a criminal, think like a money launderer. A criminal is going to want to avoid detection. They want to abuse the weaknesses in global and jurisdictional regulation to move their ill-gotten gains. So in order to achieve that, the question then must be posed: how much money, how many assets that have derived from criminal activity are moving around the world that we simply just cannot lay eyes on through the movement of that? So we've got to think the process through. We've got to think there is another way to tackle this problem. And I've got a way. I've got a way to think, to help us think about the evolution of this. Now, there is some published data around how much money is laundered. Now, please forgive me. I lowered you into a little bit of a false sense of security then. But again, that was primarily so that we can see that this issue is just simply not straight cut. Now, there is a body, the body known as the UNODC. They're the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime. Now, they do a lot of fantastic work to understand illicit financial flows, sharing of the information, so that within our organizations, we can build that into our data sets and our analytical tools and our transaction monitoring and our name screening to help us learn, develop, and spot the illicit financial flows. Now, they publish a number. The number that they publish is around 800 billion to 2 trillion US dollars. So that works out about 2 to 5% of global GDP. I think they are wrong. Now, that's a big statement to make. I am here challenging the perspective of the United Nations. And who am I to do that? But I think that's because we focus again on this monetary and this dollar value. So my next question to you all then, and thank you so much for engaging. My next question to you all is, can you name a predicate offence for money laundering. So to simplify that question, can you name a criminal activity or a crime that generates dirty money? So I'll give you a few seconds just to populate that chat. So name as many crimes as you can that generate dirty money. So, so Jonathan would say, thank you, sex trafficking. Okay, let's keep them coming. And we're going to talk about this. DTO/HTMS, Daniel, I apologize. I might need you to abbreviate that for me. Drug trafficking, Kartik, casinos. Okay, so let's keep a few more. The human trafficking is appearing. Again, good. Let's see, we've got a couple more for human trafficking, fraud, organ harvesting. Okay, good. I think we get the picture. Um, we can throw some other ones. We've got bribery, Ariana, thank you. Anna, wildlife. I'm assuming we mean illicit wildlife trafficking. Michael, shell company. So let's just talk about some of these. So just to be clear, having a shell company is not a predicate offence. You can have a shell company. It can be used for legitimate reasons, primarily, as long as there is a perfect legitimate reason. I saw casino appear. Kartik, just to be clear, a casino is not a criminal offence. Even in jurisdictions where, due to religious reasons, that gambling may be forbidden or haram, it doesn't mean it's a predicate offence for money laundering. So that's where we start to dissect. But let's talk about some of these. So the first one that I wanted to momentarily touch upon was, let's see, what have we got here? So we've got tax evasion. Interesting. So of course we've got the two principles and concepts, haven't we, of tax evasion and tax avoidance. So the tax avoidance, okay, the tax avoidance is where there are legitimate means which individuals can minimize their tax obligation. And again, I'm fairly confident everybody in this room probably participates in that in some capacity, whether it's a lottery, whether it's an insurance policy, income. Of course, you can earn so much income. So there are lots of different ways that you can do that. Now, the area that does raise the attention that we associate with trust, of course, is tax evasion. So it's the tax evasion, isn't it? Now, the challenge here, of course, tax evasion is not a predicate offence in every part of the world. So now what we actually have a difference in the predicate offences that you can potentially even be prosecuted on. So that's another global vulnerability, isn't it? Let's talk about some of these. Endangered animal trade, good. Thank you, Jonathan. I think Anna briefly alluded to that as well. Mohammed, fraud, of course, fraud, lots of different types of fraud, and we're very aware of them at the moment. But let me talk about drug trafficking. So drug trafficking is a particular challenge because we think of drug trafficking, don't we? We think of Narcos and Breaking Bad and all the things and all the films that we've seen on Netflix. Now, just to be clear, there are jurisdictions around the world that, of course, are able to sell substances legally, and in other jurisdictions that they may not be able to do so. So, for example, in Canada, the sale and distribution of marijuana is legal or can be legal. The United Kingdom, it's illegal. So again, it creates this disparity and this challenge. Now, the consideration with drug trafficking, of course, is that we think about following the money. Of course, we follow the money. That is where our efforts from an intelligence perspective and law enforcement perspective takes us. Okay, because that will help us find the kingpins and the drug cartels and help us understand these illicit financial flows. Let's not think about that for today and for today only. Let's follow the supply route of the drugs. So I'm in Europe at the moment, and the Netherlands acts as a one of the biggest recipients of drugs from South America in various ports, particularly in Rotterdam port. Now, if we place ourselves inside that container where the drugs have moved, firstly, that container is going to be transited from likely a jurisdiction that is known for the production of drugs. So let's use South America as an example, one of the biggest regions in the world that produces cocaine. Now, if you arrive at the supply chain, now of course we know that rivaling drug cartel groups invoke terror in areas to control the trafficking. Of course, terror results in the fear, the threat, and the intimidation and the violence and the death, murder, kidnap, sexual exploitation. Think about then follow the supply chain of where those drugs are made. Communities are destroyed. Wildlife is destroyed. We're not just talking about a monetary value here. We are talking about human lives in the supply chain of those drugs. So we have two issues running concurrently. The profiting of this and the profiting because of the death of human beings. Now, I want to talk about one specific typology here. Now, just for some perspective, it's estimated about $300 billion is laundered globally in the United States. Now, again, we're going to bring to life how that issue truly manifests itself. And to do that, I want to use a real example to demonstrate this issue. Now, before I go into this real example, and again, just as I'm talking through this example, please do get any questions into the chat for me to be able to tackle towards the end of this event. But the issue I want to talk about is that of counterfeit goods. Now, many of you will have heard me talk about this before, but this is a real example that we see. Before I go into this, I just want to make things, well, one particular issue very clear. The root of this conversation is going to take some particularly nasty and sinister turns. I want to be very clear that I am not accusing anybody within this, either catching the recording or attending live, of these particular issues, because it will get quite serious. Now, let's pretend we're all in the beautiful city of New York right now. Now, I've been very lucky to travel to New York many times, and what I have seen just off Fifth Avenue are lots of small shops that operate as very small and independent businesses. Now, some of these businesses are actually dotted around the city, so they've got many branches. Now, these particular shops, from a little bit of due diligence that I undertook myself on, I'd like to say an undercover visit, but there was nothing undercover about it. I might be called James, but there is no link whatsoever to a very famous British spy. But what I did observe in those shops, that there was some goods for sale. And those goods, and particularly handbags and luxury watches, were substantially cheaper than the shops that they were on just around the corner. So there was handbags, sunglasses, luxury watches for a fraction of the price. So let's pretend for a moment that we all together collectively enter one of these shops. And in fact, I was quite fancying treating myself to a new Louis Vuitton backpack for my ventures around the city. But I don't want to pay the $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 for one of those handbags. This particular shop had one for sale for $100, a bargain. So we should treat ourselves to that. But let's take a step back. Let's consider the supply chain of that bag. Clearly, something is too good to be true. So let's consider this article, this bag. For a moment, think where that bag was likely to have been made. Now, you're thinking of jurisdictions that have a significant export industry. So that could include the Southeast Asia, China, Taiwan. So let's take ourselves, let's helicopter or a plane, it's quite a long way, to the factory. Now, this factory, of course, are producing many illicit goods, which of course is a criminal offence. Who do you think is working in those factories? I'm fairly confident these are going to be individuals that are not treated humanely. Regrettably, I suspect that that's children, women, being trafficked into that, being coerced, not being paid fairly, modern day slavery. Now, let's pause for a moment because we've got two business operations running. And these businesses, of course, are using shell companies to operate and appear legitimate. But let's pause for a moment. So, of course, we have money laundering because we've got a good. We've got fraud. We've got IP breaches. We've now got, of course, potentially modern day slavery, potentially human trafficking. Now, in order to move those goods from that jurisdiction to where it's being sold, of course, around the world, and in our example, just off Fifth Avenue, those goods and services need to move. But in order to be able to move them, they're going to have to do them in mass to make it cost effective. So this is where, of course, criminal gangs will use shipment, either freight through sea or air. So now let's say they need to move a lot of these goods. Of course, you can't just say, I would like to buy a container and move these goods in, because ports around the world have a standard of controls so that they are very aware of what goods and services are moving. Also, they claim they are aware. Now, one of the most attractive ways to do this, of course, is to create a series of companies around the world. And those companies can appear legitimate. Now, what the organised crime gangs will do is dissolve themselves through the various levels of ownership and control, because they will also know on what thresholds that banks in particular will be looking to identify and address, or beneficial ownership registers would need to disclose. So they know that they can dissolve themselves through this. So they will create their companies. They will go to their financial institutions with this apparent looking, legitimate looking business that may be commingling. And the principle of commingling is using a business to do real business, but also to push through some of their ill-gotten gains as well. So now they're abusing one of the most vulnerable controls within a bank, which is trade finance. Now, just to give you some perspective, around 200 million containers move around the world each year. 1 to 2% of those are physically checked. But the real vulnerability, of course, is the banks, and the banks checking those invoices through those shipment of goods. And now we know what the typologies are for trade finance. And in fact, I had the privilege of contributing to a trade finance and trade-based money laundering article with Silent 8 that you could navigate to our website and, of course, read. So criminals know this. They also understand that the documentation process and the investigation process is laborious because it's still rather paper-based. Technology is not yet being utilized to its full capacity. Now, criminals also know that if they continue moving those products via one route, eventually their luck may run out and eventually their criminal operations would be intercepted. So they're clever. They move the goods around different jurisdictions, and those jurisdictions that tend to perform poorly on global indexes like Transparency International or the FATF grey listing. And they will also target jurisdictions that they know have a perception of weaker border controls, so that they may potentially bribe border agents or government officials. Now, we all have an understanding and appreciation on the challenges that corruption and bribery present. It takes away money and funds that are needed for government reform, fair democratic elections. It supports war taking place. It removes it from the health service, education for children. Now, this is where things go a little bit sinister, because we know that some of these jurisdictions that these goods move through are also controlled by terrorist organizations. It's also known that terrorist organizations will apply taxes to assist in the movement of goods. And the final aspect, of course, is that terrorist organizations are known to, to be part of the supply chain and the sale of those counterfeit goods. Now, this is not just luxury watches or handbags or sunglasses. This is illegal streaming sticks, streaming illegal sport or boxing. Terrorist organizations are profiting off this, and in turn are using that to spread their ideologies, their propaganda, and finance their attacks. And in fact, one of the more infamous examples was the attack in Paris a number of years ago. The Charlie Hebdo attack was alleged to have been financed or partially financed with the sale of counterfeit goods. Counterfeit goods are sponsoring and supporting terrorist attacks around the world. Take that in for a moment. Now, why is this happening? And maybe we can spend some time talking about that in the time that we have. Now, you can see why I said I'm not accusing anybody, particularly a room of seasoned financial crime experts and professionals, of that. But this is the reality. This is what's taking place. And these terrorist organizations are also using the weaknesses in these companies, in these shell organizations and shell companies, in our very own jurisdictions to create this apparent legitimate looking process of transactions. So what is happening? What is happening then? We are seeing that the weakening of specific regulation around the world with respect to ownership and control is contributing to the rise in not just financial crime, but also the innocent lives being killed around the world. We are seeing our efforts within the private sector being impeded because we simply cannot get the information to understand this global network of companies. This is the seriousness of the issue. Now, it's quite hard to come back and start to consider what this means in practice. But we have to do so. And my thanks again to those of you that are sharing some of those questions. And I will come on to some of those in a moment. So those questions are not in vain. But in the interest of time, I just need to evolve this because what I'd like to talk about, how AI can close the transparency gap. So I think the issue is clear on what the problem is with beneficial ownership transparency. Individuals are using these shell companies and trusts and corporate service providers and the abuse of nominee directors to hide behind these corporations. And this lack of transparency is enabling tax evasion, money laundering, sanctions evasion, corruption, and corporate abuse that lacks accountability. So, how do I think AI can help? Well, primarily a lot of entity resolution and network analysis because AI can analyze massive scattered data sets to link people and companies and addresses even where names are spelled differently or slightly obscured. Obscured. So entity resolution can look at these model and these variations of these same individuals and those iterations. It can look at group databases. It can model and map the relations and find hidden connections. So, for example, you could link 10 companies registered to a mail drop in Delaware, all with similar directors or offshore ties to one beneficial owner. You can analyze leaked and public data. You can mine the text. So using natural language processing tools, we can extract those names and data from the very sources that we've spoken about. So leaked documents like the Panama Papers and the Pandora Papers, public registries, SEC filings or court records, news lists, published sanctions databases. We can consider anomaly detection in corporate structures because where AI can support and that through machine learning, it can flag these companies with suspicious characteristics. So unusual company overlaps, complex chains. Now, as an ex-investigator, we would spend copious amounts of time trying to analyze and find this information. AI can prepare this and present it for us. So we as human beings can use our expertise to make that determination. I think this image on the screen is powerful. This is connecting the experience and the knowledge of humans and harvesting the power and capability of AI. AI can help us with cross-border tracing, link company records, even those that use different formats, different languages, or legal structures. It can consider various watch lists, and of course, we know that sanctions globally is published and open information. So, I could talk about this for many, many more hours, but of course, we're at 43 minutes in, and I would love to address those questions because I do appreciate you taking your time to join, and it's important to address those. So, what do I think can be done? Firstly, you joining events like this is the first step to developing awareness, and I'll come on to how we can make that difference in a moment. But governments really need to publish beneficial ownership data. And where the primary difference here is to help this amalgamate with AI is making this machine readable and developing those machine readable formats. We can develop that international cooperation, and it's really needed to start standardizing this data sharing. And of course, more investment in public and benefit AI platforms for transparency. And there are some great ones out there at the moment, open ownership, for example. Now, just to be clear, AI can't solve beneficial ownership secrecy alone. I truly believe what AI can do, and the real power is it can amplify the work of investigators, the work of regulators, and of course those journalists that are shining that spotlight on this murky world, and it will reveal those patterns, those networks, and highlight secrecy. But I'd like to end the primary part of today's webinar and today's presentation by talking about what we can do. Do not be scared to adopt technology. AI is not here to take away the experience of the many years of experience, jurisdictional nuances, cultural nuances, the emotion that we as AML professionals can bring. AI is trained on the behaviors and the reason of patterns. It's starting to master the art of money laundering and sanctions and KYC decision making. And actually, what financial institutions can do is leverage those AI tools and customize these agents that will adhere to not just the best practices, but your risk appetite, the regulatory frameworks. The second thing, training and education. I suspect many of you will be shocked about what you've heard, and in fact, how counterfeit goods that we openly see being sold on Instagram, Snapchat, or even walking down the street are contributing to this problem. Embrace that. Share this information with your children. Share this information with your colleagues. Embrace due diligence. Due diligence is not there to make lives difficult for our customers. And actually, good due diligence can educate our customers. But from a commercial perspective, truly understanding our customers can only be a good thing. It can help us identify the needs that our customers have. Raise awareness and consider and make sure that we do not unintentionally support this by inadvertently buying some of these activities. So that brings me to the end of the primary presentation, and I can see that we've got one or two people that have got questions in. So I'd like to just tackle some of this. Firstly, my thanks to let me start with an observation because Ariana, I greatly appreciate you sharing this. The fear is that financial institutions will see the financial benefit of AI only and then take away the regulatory jobs to save money. I can share, Ariana, that my experiences of that are quite different. And let me provide an example. The FATF, in fact, through their recommendations, and recommendation one, okay, recommendation one is the risk-based approach. Now, the very crux of the risk-based approach is about deploying your resource where the risk is higher. Now, I'm almost certain that many of you will have interacted or seen specific situations, transactions not in line with the profile of the KYC of a customer, a rapid movement of funds, unknown counterparties, a slightly higher than normal or unusual transaction. And due to the global enforcement culture that's been generated, we become quite suspicious. And actually, inadvertently, what we do is we file SARS because we want to protect our organization, but we're actually hampering and impacting the efforts to fight financial crime because we're overwhelming intelligence units. Now, what the risk-based approach is really good at, and this is where AI is really powerful, think of all that noise, right? All the noise, the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of alerts that are generated through questionable transactions that we spend our time, our experience and expertise on. It's not really financial crime, but we're not really sure what else to do with it. So we spend a lot of our time and money wasted in trying to resolve these non-issues. Now, what the power of AI is saying, we're going to take care of all this noise. You're still going to keep your resource, but you're deploying it where the risk is higher and that we need the expertise and experience. So I think part of the power of these events are trying to shift that culture, that AI isn't there to save money. AI is there to improve efficiency and productivity. Dorothy, you've made a comment. Look, that there are lots of providers out there that offer, education. And again, I would emphasize the efforts of the collaboration between Transform Finance and Silent 8 and events like this is all valuable. It's all raising awareness of this particular issue. Next question, Jonathan Sharp. Jonathan, I've got a feeling that you and I have engaged quite a lot. So if that's the case, I'm very appreciative that you are here. So would the regulators be better off trying to identify the root cause and encourage measures rather instill fear over mistakes being made by MLROs? I would somewhat agree with that, and actually that could be genuinely this evolution of enforcement. Now you've got two problems here. You keep finding firms, and you build and you swell the coffers, and that's been very pessimistic. And organisations absorb some of those fines. Or you could say, well, actually, there is individual accountability on MLROs. They're the nominated officers, or the designated officers, or the bank secrecy officers uh, within a firm. But is that placing too much risk on the individual? Because clearly, no individual is going to go and take one of those roles without doing their own due diligence on the control environment as well within that organisation. So we've got to think different. And for me, this is about public and private sector collaboration. Also, public to public sector collaboration is important, and this is a great example of that. But we could start getting to a point where information is being shared back from financial intelligence units. So to talk about these methodologies, to feedback on these SARs. But of course, the problem is that we're filing too many SARs globally. Now, I'm pleased to say that many jurisdictions are starting to make efforts through monthly podcasts, through sharing of national reports. Still some way to go, but you're right. We've got to shift away from that fear of personal accountability and personal enforcement and actually how that supports us. An anonymous attendee, what are the biggest challenges law enforcement face when trying to stop and stem the flow of counterfeit goods? Well, actually, this is a problem that, and thank you to that question, that has been reared up many times. And I want to use an example of Denmark. Now, Denmark, within their national risk assessment for money laundering, identified that they had a real problem with cash-based laundering. Now, these businesses that we spoke about that set up these corporations to sell some of their counterfeit goods or whatever that might be, they will generally prefer to take cash because cash is king. It's a bit harder to say how much has been taken. Now, that doesn't mean just because cash involved money laundering is happening. So the challenge, of course, is that when those funds enter the financial system, um, they move around quite quickly and they spread around. Now, Denmark identified we've got a real problem, lots of cash-based laundering. We need to do something about it. So they made that public and they started to bring in some really strong and positive reform into how cash is handled to start to deter that criminal activity. And what that provoked was strengthening of controls and what appeared to be a weakening of some of those that cash-based laundering that was happening. Now, that was the surface. But the reality was very different. Criminal organizations and OCGs continued to launder the money, but they took different methods. And what that spiked was cash smuggling across Europe. Now, that creates two problems. All of a sudden, this intelligence and information that you had, that the intelligence units were gathering on how criminal gangs are operating and the illicit financial flows and the third parties that were involved, all of a sudden that data was gone. The second thing is if the cash was being smuggled across a border, that was then creating another issue for that jurisdiction. And then, of course, the issue of data sharing came in. And although that there are a lot of aspirations to improve that, jurisdictions are generally still quite protective. So that can be the unintended consequence. Now, the final thing, of course, is, and bringing it back to the question, if you close that business down, the reality is it springs up somewhere else. So the challenge, of course, is you've got to determine, do you close that down, knowing that you're going to lose all of your ability to understand what and who is involved in that? Or do you keep it open to continue gathering information, to start to build those networks? And that's the challenge that law enforcement have. And it's about understanding, how much intelligence do they need? How much, and that's also the challenge that the private sector face as well. Do we file a SAD? Do we exit? Well, we do that because we want to protect our reputation. But are we then stemming the flow of information that's helping prevent that problem? I think that I have been and had the privilege to be able to tackle some of that. So as I sort of wrap up for today's event, and again, I'm sincerely thank you that you've all grateful that you've all taken some time to join me for today's event, and my thank you to Transform Finance and Silent 8 for making this happen and partnering. Please do remain in contact. Transform Finance and Silent 8 are producing lots of fantastic content regular webinars, white papers, just head over to the LinkedIn pages, join, connect. You're welcome to sort of connect with me as well. But my sincere thank you to you all for joining today's event. I wish you all a fabulous day or evening from where you're joining us from around the world. Keep in touch, stay connected with us all, and I wish you all the very best. Thank you again. Take care, everyone. See you all soon.